Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Wave if you can't hear me. Okay. Thanks for coming out to Holy Cross Cemetery today for our second official cemetery walk. Last Sunday, as you know, we thought we were going to be rained out, so we had George Anthony, who traveled over to do the native graves. Since he was here, we had him go to the library and give a talk, and I do have a recorded copy of that, and I will put it on our YouTube channel, probably this week it'll get uploaded.
Can you hear that?
And so today we're going to pick up at where we would have started last Sunday. So thank you for coming for that, and it looks like you can't hear back there. Is this better? Unfortunately, that's as loud as it goes. Okay, now you can hear me, Diane. Good. Okay, so I guess I should say everybody should be very aware of social distancing. So I've done my part to make sure that you're aware of that and do your best to honor that for us. Today we're going to start with Jacqueline. Well, I want to introduce Jacqueline. As I said before, she is the real hero of all of this, doing our town and helping to pull things together. And our family historian to start off with will be Ed Palmer. Would you like to say anything, Jacqueline? Jackie. I always call you Jackie. I don't know why.
Well, I just wanted to, again, thank you all for coming. This is organized as part of our NEA Big Read, Community Big Read grant that we received at the library. And our town is the, what, am I not talking in it right?
Closer to your mouth.
Closer to my mouth? Okay. I keep getting waving from Diane back there, so. So our town, the third act of our town takes place in the cemetery. And hence, when we were coming up with ideas for the events that we would hold, we thought, well, let's hold some cemetery walks and learn a little bit about the history of the people who came and settled on Beaver Island. And so that's what we've been doing, and we've got 3 more planned. Next week we'll be here also at the southeast corner, and then the following week we'll be at the Township Cemetery, which is down in town, and then we'll be back out here to finish up across the road. So that's the plan. So we're going to start out, as Lori said, with Edward Palmer. He's going to talk a little bit about the Palmer family, and he's going to sing us a little song, I think, right? Uh-huh. Okay, so we'll let him take it away.
Good morning to all you people. What a beautiful day. The only way I can start this history situation of my family, I don't know all that much about them, but my great-grandfather is buried up on top of the hill up there, Patrick Boyle, who came from Erinmore Island in the early 1850s. And his son, Willie Boyle, was my grandfather, and he's buried with his wife, Elizabeth Boyle. She was an O'Connor. She's from Ireland. Ed Palmer was from Scotland. He was the great-grandfather. And they moved to, he went to Mackinac Island. They married a young lady there, and then they moved to Beaver Island. It was in the 1850s or so, like that. Then they moved to South Fox Island, and they raised 8 kids over there. And they raised 2 Indian kids, but nobody knew who they were or anything like that. But then Joe Ed Palmer would be my great-grandfather, was a fisherman from he's from Scotland. He was fishing up in the upper Michigan at Scotts Point. He drowned it up there. They found his body on the beach. And some say that's how it's got its name, Scotts Point, but I'm not sure. Anyway, then his wife remarried again, and they moved to Beaver Island. And then the Boyle side came from Erinmore Island. And Elizabeth, my grandmother Liz, was married to Willie Boyle. She was from, she was Irish and she lived in Quebec. Then they moved to Beaver Island. She moved to Beaver Island and married Willie Boyle. Bruts, they call him, Bruts. And they had 7 kids. And as they got older, they moved downstate, Manistee and Ludington. And some of them stayed here. My uncles went sailing on the Great Lakes. My other uncle was a policeman in Manistee, Michigan. My mother lived on the island all her life. She was no further than Manistee, Michigan in her lifetime. And she went down to her Manistee, her sister's house, and she wasn't used to telephones. And her sister said, Lorraine, the phone's for you, it's your brother. Oh, she said, wait till I go fix my hair. She wasn't used to phones. Anyway, she came back to the island, and she was 82 when she passed away. And my dad, Clarence Palmer, was born and raised in Northport. His father and mother lived on South Fox Island. Jeremiah Palmer and Hannah. She was Norwegian. And they moved Traverse City back to Northport, and up to Beaver Island. And then the old greenhouse behind McDonough's store back there, next to Pan White's, is their homestead. That old green on the back road there. That homestead was set there by 3 different little buildings from the campsite up the west side of the island. They were moved there years ago and put together. That's how that house got there. There's a lot of history in that house. I won't go into that. So anyway, Clarence Palmer was Jeremiah Palmer. He was born in Northport and lived on the island. And he married Lorraine Boyle, which is Willie Boyle's daughter. And they're buried right here. They died in 95, back in the 90s. And then my sister, I got 3 brothers and 4 sisters here, buried here. Yeah. And my oldest sister, she just passed when she was 88, Virginia. And there was Irene, Robert, Russell, Perry, and Elizabeth, Grace. And so there must have been a big wood pile around there someplace. So anyway, through the years, as I grew up, my grandma Boyle up there, she'd go to bed at night, she'd take out a harmonica and she'd play it every night. She'd play the harmonica. And she always wanted me to learn the harmonica. So I took her up on it. And one tune she always liked was Over the Waves. And these people here, I played a lot of music with my brothers and sisters, and they liked that. And I also played for a lot of people here that are gone now through my lifetime of playing music. They all kind of like that also. I'm going to play it for you right now if you don't mind.
Yeah. Like me on
No, just up in the Mozart. Okay. This was Frankie and Gracie's favorite tune, Frankie Ackerman and Grace. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It was an honor to show up. And I'm glad I got a chance to play the tune for these guys again. Thank you ever so much.
Up next is the Wilkie family, and Bobby Wilkie will talk about their family.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for the Beaver Island District. Closer.
Mike.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. All right. Thank you to the Beaver Island District Library for sponsoring this awesome event. I'm not sure I can top what Ed just shared with all of you, but I'm here to share the Welkie story. I'm going to talk about how we got to. I'd first like to, before I talk, I'd like to share my mother's here, Sue Welkie. She's the one that has the home by the Ball Diamond in town. She first came to the island in 1955, the year before she married my dad, to kind of, as he would say, check her out, see if she got along here on the island, and was a good fit. We're both privileged to live here on the island 7 months of the year. We have yet to try a winter out, but who knows, someday we might give that a chance. We lost my dad, Bob Welkie, in early 2016, and he's buried way over yonder where the zinnias are, those tall flowers, that last row of tombstones over there. I'll explain where the other Welkies are buried here in the cemetery, and actually elsewhere. There's actually a Welkie cemetery here on the island, and I'll explain where that is as I go through my presentation, and I share the story of how we came to be on Beaver Island. My grandparents, William and Elizabeth Welkie, had 4 sons, Bill, Chuck, Don, and then my dad, Bob Welkie, between 1922 and 1934. They lived in the city of Detroit, and years later they lived on a farm in southern Oakland County. Why they were in Detroit, they were neighbors to Kitty McCauley, who was raised on the McCauley Farm, which is a large farm that's south of Welkie Airport and west of the golf course. Her husband was an editor of the Detroit Times newspaper. So they had 3 boys who were the same ages as my older uncles, Bill, Chuck, and Don. So they were always playing together. And as they were growing up playing together, those 3 boys would come up with their neighbors' kids and work at the McCauley Farm. And we're talking about in the 30s. So those boys were coming up in the 1930s to play and actually work at the McCauley Farm. So in 1935, when my dad was 1 year old, his parents and his godparents, can't hear me? I'm as close as I can get to this. Sorry. My dad and his godparents went to the UP for a 2-week vacation. And they rented a cabin that turned out to have snakes at it. My grandmother hated snakes. So she told her husband, William, let's go to Beaver Island. The boys are there. We can find a cabin on Beaver Island. So they rented a cabin at Nomad. Went down to Nomad. And for those of you unfamiliar with Beaver Island, Nomad was a small community along Lake Michigan near Lake Genazareth. It's long gone. But what do they find when they get there in the cabin? Snakes. So they travel into town, and where do they go? They go to the Shamrock. And who owns and operates the Shamrocks in the 30s? Archie Lafreniere. So they asked Archie, where can we rent another cabin for a 2-week vacation? Well, you can rent my house. It's almost finished, a new constructed building. It's almost finished. For instance, the stairway is not yet built, and you need to take a ladder to go to the upstairs where the bedrooms are. And they gladly accept that rental challenge, and when they go in, no snakes. So they really appreciate that. So while they're here, they meet Mel Gallagher and her brother Frank, who own, actually their father, Big Owen Gallagher, or Big Owen as everyone calls him, They think that's one word, but it's really Big Owen Gallagher. They meet them at what is now Welke Airport. They own that property, which is really a farm. So they meet Mel Gallagher and Frank Gallagher, and Mel actually teaches my dad to walk here on Beaver Island. So as the boys grow older, they come up every summer and they work on the farms here. They stay at the cabins, the McDonough cabins on Sand Bay back in the day, and they work on the Gallagher farm, they work on the McDonough's farm, they work on the Schmidt's farm, which is a large farm, as you might remember from 3 weeks ago. Pam Grassman mentioned it. It was a farm that started from the other side of the cemetery, and back in the way back days, it went all the way to Lake Michigan, a little Sand Bay. And at least there's one or two other farms that escapes me right now where they worked at. During the war years, my uncles that were older than my dad, all were in the service. So my dad would come up and stay with Mel and Frank and work at the Gallagher farm. In 1936, the guys would come up hunting, deer hunting, and last year was 84 consecutive years my family had family members coming up deer hunting. So my oldest uncle, Bill and Betty, they're buried here in the cemetery. Their cemetery site, this line of trees right here, and then you have the 2-track road right there. They're buried just on the other side of the trees with the Coulters, who are Betty's parents. So that's where their burial site is. They are Paul's parents. Bill and Betty had 5 children. They moved to the island in 1968. While my grandfather, William, was a police officer in the city of Detroit, my Uncle Bill was a police officer also in the city of Detroit, and they left Detroit, kit and caboodle, moved to the island in 1968. When he got here, he was asked to be a sheriff's deputy here. Since he was already a police officer, he agreed to become a Charlevoix County Sheriff's Deputy here for the island. He was also a contractor, and he was a pilot. They ran a construction company as well. They opened the airport in 1971. Welke Aviation began in 1975, so this year's their 45th anniversary. But they're also connected through Joe Phillips to his aviation company. And you can see their new poster up on their business to celebrate their anniversaries, because it's the 45th year of Welke Aviation this year. Now my Uncle Chuck, who's the second oldest son, he married an islander. He married Catherine Schmidt in Holy Cross Catholic Church. While Chuck is gone, Catherine is still a spry 93-year-old woman who lives near Gladwood, Michigan. And Chuck is buried in that area. Actually, it's Beaverton, Michigan. My Uncle Don and Aunt Dory, they bought the McCauley farm in 1955. And they're actually buried. They both have since passed away. They're buried in a cemetery, a small legal cemetery called the Welke Cemetery on that farm property. They have 2 children. 1961, let me back up in years. In the late 50s, my Uncle Bill, Aunt Betty, and my parents built a small cabin on Wicklow Beach. But by the early 60s, both couples realized with expanding families, they needed other properties. So my Uncle Bill and Aunt Betty bought out the Mel Gallagher and Frank Gallagher's property, bought out that farm. And that's when, in 1961, my parents bought the property from Big Owen Gallagher's family, also owned that. Sometimes a lot of the islanders owned farm property, and they owned town property as well. Big Owen Gallagher was a 41-year lighthouse Coast Guardsman here on the island. So he had his family working the farm, so he could stay in town and work at the lighthouse. So he had turned that property over to his son Peter, who my parents were able to buy that property to in 1961. But they could not move into it for a year and a half because the Coast Guardsmen were staying in that house under a contract. So eventually they were able to stay in it with their 7 kids, of which I'm one of them. Of the 7 children, 4 of us own property here on the island. and are fortunate to get here whenever we're able to get here. One of her sons, my brother Scott, and his partner Michelle are able to live here year-round. Three of my brothers own a farm here on the island, and you see it off East Side Drive, the Welke family farm, and it's basically a deer hunting camp. And just one last quick story before as I wrap up here. You see two signs on Kings Highway that honor Bob Welke, my dad, with the Adopt the Highway cleanup program. The person who sponsored that, who wants to remain nameless, when he was setting that up through Charlevoix County Road Commission, he found out that a lot of what he was doing was from Michigan Department of Transportation. My dad was a long-time 41-year employee of Michigan Department of Transportation. He brought Adopt the Highway to the state of Michigan for the state roads. So counties would rely sometimes on MDOT to have a lot of their data, a lot of the education and so forth. My dad started as a rodman working on survey crews on freeways. Each of the 7 kids, I can tell you how old freeways are in different parts of Michigan based on how old we are. I can tell you how old I-94 is in the Paw-Paw-Hartford area based on how old my brother and I are, but you don't want to know because I'm not telling you how old we are. So with this anyhow, my dad's career, he started, as I said, working on a survey crew on freeways. He ended up as the department's director just before he retired in 1996 and 1997. So he had an outstanding career, and those signs help recognize and memorialize his contribution to the state of Michigan. And we thank the person who set that up, that recognizes those miles of trash pickup along Kings Highway. So we thank that person for memorializing our dad. And thank you for letting me share the story of the Welke family on Beaver Island.
Okay, so now we're going to ask everybody to move, get a little exercise, and we're going to walk through the cemetery over here to where the Coles and the Riskers area is. So maybe they can lead us if they know about where they're going in that direction. And we'll meet you over there. You can set up wherever, and we'll learn about those two families. She's been on the island forever also, and she's got family members buried here in the cemetery. So I'm going to turn her over to you.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay? Yep. My ancestors are two of the German families that came to Beaver Island around 1900. I wish I had a song or something, but I have a limerick that I wrote a few years ago. When Father Zugelder was in our midst, the drinking Irishman gave him the fits. So he added to the flock with some good German stock. The Ricksters, the Pishners, the Schmidts. The Schmidts and the Pishners came from Grand Rapids area. Father had posted in German-speaking church bulletins, and so they found it there. And the Ricksters came up from Illinois. It had been a long road until they got there. They came from Germany, Henry, Elizabeth, and some of their older children in the 1870s. Henry had been in the Franco-Prussian War and had had his throat cut with a bayonet from ear to ear, so always wore chin whiskers to cover the scar. They went first to New York, where he worked in coal mines, and Pennsylvania after that, adding children to the family along the way. South Dakota, they homesteaded for 7 years, and then donated that homestead to the Catholic Church there, which I guess still has a plaque in the back with his name, and moved there to Texas to farm, where it didn't rain for 5 years. And so they were working their way back up through the United States, and were in Illinois, in a German community there, when they saw that there were jobs and land and opportunities available on Beaver Island. Joseph Schmidt, who came up from Grand Rapids, actually made it first, and Father had found the property that is now our family homestead Joseph Schmidt actually signed the papers for that for Henry Rickskers, who wasn't here yet. 20 years later, Henry's youngest son, George, married one of Joseph's daughters, Otelia, and those are my grandparents. Uh, George was the youngest in the family, so the older children had grown up and gone away by the time he was an adult. So he ended up with the family farm because his parents were elderly by that time. So he moved his young bride in there and helped to take care of the farm with his parents. So my dad grew up in the same farmhouse that was built in 1900 and 1901 with when Henry and Elizabeth came up here. They had 6 children, and Aunt Katie, of course, is here, and my Aunt Margaret. Henry and Elizabeth, their grandparents are behind. And many of the older children stayed in South Dakota. When my grandfather retired after a long life of working, he traveled around the United States to see his older brothers that he hadn't seen since he was 3 years old. They had stayed there when he came to Beaver Island. And I don't know if they'd exchanged letters over the years or what, but that's about it. That's about all that I know.
Cindy, you want to tell them where the farm is?
And the farm, if anybody doesn't know, is right down the road here, just past the cement factory that used to be Sunnyside School, the white farmhouse where my cousin Bob is still gardening there. It's a centennial farm. It's been worked since they built it in 1900.
Cindy, your great-grandfather, Joe Schmidt, built the ultimate Holocaust.
Sure. Do you want me to talk about the Schmidts a little bit?
Sure.
Joseph Schmidt grew up in the Black Forest area of Germany, which is famous for making cuckoo clocks and fine woodwork. And so I don't know if he had experience there. His mother was trying to keep him out of being drafted into the Boer War. So she took all of her grocery funds and put him on a ship to America all by himself when he was 17 years old. He ended up in the Grand Rapids area where he met his wife, Catherine, and started his family there. That was where he was when he saw the advertisement for Beaver Island. Some of the old woodwork that is in the Circle M around the sanctuary area and things like that is his woodwork. A lot of the older cabinetry, a lot of the work inside of the church was done by Joseph Schmidt. You can still see in older houses some of his fancy woodwork.
Okay, so now we have another family, the Cole family, which was interesting when Bobby was up and she was talking about staying down at Nomad because the Coles, grandparents, great-grandparents, kind of ran the whole town down there. They had, it was a small town, but they had places to rent. They had a post office and businesses set up down there. So now we're going to hear from the Coles. They're buried over this way. And come on up. What, you want to talk?
This is going to be a 2-stage talk. Paul's going to do more on the island. I was just going to talk about how the Coles got to America.
Put the microphone closer to your mouth.
Okay.
Closer.
And talk loud.
The Coles were, everybody thought they were German, but my great-grandmother was half German, so that's how that got started. But they were actually Irish. And they were brought to America during the Revolutionary War by the British. They were prisoners of the British, and they would empty their prisons and bring these people over for cannon fodder, basically. So these two brothers were fighting on the British side in New York in a little battle, and they were on a bridge, got trapped on a bridge, and one brother died, and one that survived immediately deserted and went to the American side, being the good Irishman that he was. And he survived that war. And he ended up in upstate New York. And he married a woman who was half Mohawk Indian and half Dutch. And they had a little farm. And then they moved west to the frontier. And they went all the way to the edge of the frontier in 1820. They ended up in Michigan. That was the Wild West. And that would be what's now Lapeer County. Had a large farm there, very large family, 2 generations in Lapeer County. Then they moved to Jackson County, and then they moved to Big Rapids, and then they went to Gat. My great-grandparents, my great-grandfather, ended up in Bel Air, and Gat moved here in sometime in the 1920s. He bought 450 acres with his nomad down by Lake Connecticut. And that's how we got here. And Paul's going to do the rest.
I think you're doing good.
Garrett's named after that grandfather, Gat, right?
Yes.
Great grandfather.
Well, I wish Garrett would have kept going. I thought he was doing a good job here. Our family historian, Robert Cole, actually is in New York, and he really has a lot of great knack for this, but I'll just kind of fill in a little bit. So, Gat and Julia arrived and settled down at the south end on the 450 acres, and they started to set up a lumber mill for cedar shakes. That was a way that they felt they could make some money to begin with, and they had a boat in the dock down there, and they would fill the boat up and try to get as many trips over and sell cedar shakes over to the mainland. Over a period of time, they slowly kind of expanded down there and built cabins for people to rent, and then they also had a dance hall down there. That dance hall, the cabin that was the dance hall, is still standing, and for many years, that was a dance hall then made into a cabin. If you go down to Nomad and you go to the far end of the property, it's still standing there. So they had quite a large family. I think 7 children. And they eventually had a store. They set up a store down there, and then Julia Cole decided to put a post office down there also. So then it officially became kind of a town where people could get provisions that lived on the south end and come and stay if you wanted to, and mail would come to Nomad. So the family continued to expand, and Everett and Raymond Cole set up in town where what used to be the Gillespie Garage. They decided to make that into a store and a dance hall also. And so for quite a few years, they ran that. And then they unfortunately were part of the Merrill disaster. Oswald Boyd back in 37, they were salvaging gas out in the wintertime, and there was an explosion, and they both passed away. So Gat and Julia stayed on for quite a while, but ended up in their later years settling in Charlevoix and are buried in Charlevoix. But before that tragedy happened, Raymond Cole started courting Grace Gillespie, and they had a son named Donald. And so Donald is our father. And my Grams ended up staying here on the island after that tragedy, and she was a cook at the King Strang Hotel for many years, and then ended up running the Clarny Inn, which was a Cull household. She cooked for many years, I think 17, 18 years there. And my dad was about 25, and Grams was like, I think you need to really get married. You're getting kind of old. And he said, well, okay. And he said, well, there's 2 Wills on the island. I think they're both good. Take your pick. So he was referring to a little left or a little Cole, or a little Cunahan, excuse me. My mom was a Cunahan. So he decided to start courting Lil Cunahan, and lo and behold, they got married. And the day that they got married, after the ceremony, he said to the priest, you got a minute? And he said, yeah. I said, well, let's go over, and I need to pick out some cemetery plots. And he said, well, how many do you want? He said, well, I'm going to have 9 kids. Give me 9. And he had 9 children. And there's the plots right there. Other than that, I mean, we grew up on the island, and like many people on the island, you had several different things to make a living. And my dad worked for the county road commission, maintaining the roads, and my grams had the Clarny, and she was getting tired. She couldn't get as much fish as she wanted and as fresh as she wanted. So she said to Dad one day, "You need to catch fish." And sure enough, he got some nets and went out and started catching fish. So we had a commercial fishing operation for many years, but it was because my grams wanted some fresh fish. So, yeah, she started it all. So that's it. Anything to add? Or?
Down at Nomad, when Gat and Julia turned that into a little town, one of the reasons was there was no road down the east side like there is now. That was done in WPA days, I believe, did most of the east side. So there was a track that you could get through in the summer, but the rest of the year you couldn't really get down there. But once in a while, when the ice was right, my great-grandfather would take his Model A or G, whatever jalopy it was he had, and drive on the ice all the way up into the harbor, which didn't always work out so well. So one time he made it all the way, comes in the harbor, and he went right through the ice just in front of the Shamrock House. And the reason he was coming in is he brought a hog in to have butchered. The hog was still alive in the back seat. My great-grandfather got out, but the hog didn't. So the next day they pulled it up and took it to the butcher. It kept quite well overnight. So. But that's one of the reasons Nomad turned into what it did, is because it was so isolated back then. You couldn't get there. And that's all I had to add. Thanks.
Where did the name Nomad come from? Do you know?
We think it was the name of his boat, but we're not sure. His first boat, yeah.
Oh, we got somebody that's talking back there.
Yeah, and then there was the Rambler. But, so we think it was from the name of the Coles, all the way from the Revolutionary War, always were near water, everywhere they went. Whether it was a river, or they had a water mill, or they were on a pond. And so when they made it to Beaver Island, they finally got to real water. And the other thing about Gat and Julie is most of the Coles had a mill. By the time they got to Michigan in the 1820s, all of them had a mill of some kind for lumber, whether it was shingles or for the railroad cants or house lumber. And he had a mill before he moved to Beaver Island, and it burned down. That was in, I think that one was in Bel Air. And some of his relatives actually came here and worked in that mill, the same mill that they worked in Bel Air. Anything else?
Raymond, you couldn't say
It's good. Yeah. Good. That's a pretty good historian, whether you like him or not.
I would just like to say, for everybody's benefit in the Cole family, that there were a lot of island families that came here before the Coles, but none of them made the mark like the Coles did with the town of Nomad. Garrett and Julia Cole were industrious people. The hall he's talking about was known as Cole's Lodge on Lake Gennesareth that they built, and it was a resort in addition to everything else that they had. But they had homes for their workers, rental houses, a store, a post office, and a big dock at Nomad. And you'll see it nowadays just shown as Nomad Corner on the island map. But when I first came back to Beaver Island and we started renting houses, building houses, and doing real estate, I'd get calls from people downstate that would say, we're coming to Beaver Island, which town do you recommend we stay at? Because Nomad was put on the state of Michigan map and remained there until almost the late 70s on most state of Michigan road maps. The town disappeared, but the name didn't. The Cole family had a town on the island, and they're the only family that did that.
Thank you.
Pam O'Brien, do you want to come talk about any of the people in this area?
No, it's all relative.
If you didn't hear that, she says it's all relative.
Everybody.
Everybody's related. Alvin is, I think there's Mary and Archie Minor in this area somewhere. You want to come talk about that branch of the family, the Lafayette?
Yeah, you can see up here these flags. There's 3 or 4 flags right there together. All these flags you see here, every one that has a flag here was a veteran, served in the military one time or another. But my Aunt Liz and 3 of her children are up there. Isabel, she was in the Army, and Archie Minor was World War II, so they're buried there, and their son John. So all of them are there. But then Pat, well, we did him a couple weeks ago. He was back where the other Lafayette are. So the Lafayette are divided into 2 sections. The one there, and then up here where these 4 up here are buried. So they're split up a little bit. And then here you got some of the McDonoughs back here. That'd be Mary and Bert McDonough. Mary Bert was well known. She was a true saint here on the island. Everyone loved her. So she's back here, McDonoughs, and their son Don was in the Korean War. So that's that takes care of that part of it. Well, then Bing and Madonna here, there, and Bing was in World War II also.
Thank you, Alvin. You know, as Pam says, it's all relative, and when you look around, some of the tombstones will have maiden names on it, like Madonna, McDonough. Her mom was Mary Burt, and Bert was her dad, that are buried here. You know, so there's a lot of connections between the families on the island. If you don't already know that, many of you do because you are island families. But there's a lot of overlap between, you know, who's married to who, and it helps when you have families of like, you know, 8 or 10 kids that marry into other families, and sometimes it's sisters and brothers that are marrying into the same families, and so it kind of expands in that direction. Is there anybody else here that has family buried that they would like to tell a story about or tell a little bit about? Nobody? Okay. Well, in that case, I thank you all for coming. Our next walk is actually next Sunday. That was the scheduled walk, and we're going to do this section over here, the southeast section of the cemetery. So if you have people buried there and you would like to talk about them, you know, please get a hold of Lori or myself. Or we'll come track some of you down too, so be aware of that. Okay. Yes?
Does anyone know where everybody
The Burns? The Burns? Pam could probably tell you where they're at.
They're up here. Straight ahead.
Okay. All right, so Pam is the queen of the cemetery. She knows where everybody's buried out here. She has the map. So if you need to know where your ancestors are buried, you can talk to Pam. Okay? And Alvin wanders around up here a lot too, so.
Put the flags out.
He puts the flags out, so he knows a lot about where people are buried as well. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of the day.